Welcome to the Smarter SMSF podcast, the show where we discuss the latest insights, ideas and strategies with self-managed super funds, all designed to help make smarter decisions and equip you to be at the top of your game. I'm your host, Aaron Dunn. Hi everyone and welcome to this week's podcast. Aaron Dunn here, and today we're going to be looking at the recent release of the SMSF Benchmark Report for December of 2017, released by Class. And today we have Kevin Bungard, CEO of Class Limited, who will be discussing with me the latest report on do pensions or SMSF pension funds match their stereotype. So thanks for joining me today, Kevin.
Thank you for having me on board. It's I love chatting about the benchmark reports, and always a pleasure.
Thank you. And I guess one of the real interesting things that comes out of these reports is it allows the industry to flesh out some of the issues that statistically we've only ever been able to see from the ATO on an annual basis. And the first question to you is around, pension funds represent about half of all SMSFs within the sector today. And as a result, the characteristics that define these SMSFs vary significantly to the averages and medians that we see ordinarily published by the regulator each year in their statistical overview. So what were some of the findings or insights that you can share out of this December 2017 quarterly report?
I should say that I think the interesting thing about a lot of the data that gets reported about SMSFs is that it's averages. And I think the averages can hide a lot of variation. And one of the quite surprising things was the difference between the pension balances and the accumulation balances. Again, not entirely surprising, but I think that the magnitude of the difference between those that are in accumulation phase, where there's nobody in the fund that's currently in a pension phase, about $773,000 was the average there. Mm-hmm. And then on the average on the pension side, it was just nudging up to just under $2 million. So, anyone who went to the SMSF Association conference last week would know that starts to raise some interesting questions about estate planning and so forth. So it's kind of interesting in terms of a number for an average member, fund with two members. So there's a whole bunch of other data about the kind of asset classes and where the pension funds are investing, which I'm sure we'll get a chance to chat through as well.
Yeah, so you're right. In terms of the estate planning issue, has certainly been arguably the most interesting and topical issue when it comes to these reforms, because of course we have our transfer balance cap that a person needs to comply with. Now we have a pension paying fund here with a balance of $1.94 million. If the typical fund is about, I think according to the ATO, is about 1.9 members per fund, this is clearly going to be highlighting some significant estate planning issues around a member having to reduce balances back to the $1.6 million transfer balance cap in the event of a member. So you touched on briefly, I guess, there some of those issues, but what do you see as the things that practitioners need to be focusing on, given this statistical amount that is clearly higher than the transfer balance account when we think about succession inside a fund?
I think it's really interesting that at the conference last week, the discussions about estate planning and dealing with particularly pensions and how they work in the situation where it's sort of reverting to the surviving member. It's interesting we're dealing with that now. I think we've literally reached the kind of, I guess, we've dealt with all of the upfront stuff we needed to deal with for the super reform, and we're now literally dealing with the tail end piece here in terms of the estate planning and what happens when a member dies. And the challenges there, I think, are quite complicated depending on the structures, the types of pensions that you have and so forth. And some of that's still being worked out. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But I think, yeah, that number is kind of interesting in kind of highlighting the amount of work that probably the industry needs to be doing to make sure that they are getting in place the appropriate strategies and figuring out, you know, exactly what they're going to do with those pensions, what they're going to do if they have to roll amounts back. Do they need to make room on the pension caps, as we discussed in an earlier report? And so I think the importance of some of those sort of strategies, both in terms of estate planning and managing your caps and limits and managing the types of pensions and whether it's a, you know, whether you have to, there's restrictions around what you can do with a death benefit pension. So, and there's the more stringent restrictions about what you can do if it's a tryst, for example, or was it previously and is now a retirement phase income stream. So it's some very complex questions there that really I think the industry is only just getting to grips now because we've been so busy with all the stuff we had to do leading up to this point that now that's kind of, I guess, the next area that people need to focus on.
Yeah, and I think that was something that I observed, and I spoke about this in my last podcast. So I did 3 key takeaways in my last podcast from the SMSF Association conference. And I think there was a very linear approach to learning last year where now we're sort of, now that it's chiseled into our mind, we can start to think a little bit more laterally around, you know, some of these issues. And, you know, like you said in there, we touched on a couple of quarters ago when we spoke about one of the reports, you know, about the concepts of wanting to claw back amounts against the transfer balance cap where a client is taking more than the minimum pension. I know within our membership platform, we've now built out a lot of the documentation that now needs to be done around that. When we consider the practical compliance guidance that the Commissioner gave us to deal with commutations in the lead up to 30 June. So we've built additional paperwork that, you know, sort of ensures that we have a valid commutation in play. And so it's all those things that, you know, on top of the fact that we've got some nuances between, you know, legacy pensions and death benefit pensions and what we can do. So it certainly is an area that we're going to have to spend a lot more time on and really talk to our clients and make this top of mind as we work through, you know, and still work through many of these reform issues.
It's very important, I think, that it's not just a matter of administrators understanding what needs to be done. It's that communication and education and putting the right documentation. I think the guidance from the ATO has been very clear on that, that you're expected to get that in place. So if you're not on top of your game here, your clients are going to miss out.
So one of the things that in the session I spoke at the conference that I had David Basoli and Adam Goldstein was about, and which I think is quite interesting as we work through some of these issues, was Adam made the comment that compliance kind of becomes the new strategy. And you mentioned it just then, you know, there are a lot of things that we need to go through and having this information readily available in terms of, you know, having your data current and using integrations and so forth to ensure that you can have these conversations with clients in a timely manner is now going to become more important than ever. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I agree totally. I think that we're in a situation now where the caps and the limits and the regulatory regime are all set up to basically say that you need to have the information at your fingertips if you are going to work with your clients and get the most effective outcome for them. I think in your session you were talking about whether you're thriving or surviving, and I think if you're aiming to thrive in this environment, you've got to embrace that. You've got to realise that that's the new normal, is having information at your fingertips. You can't be trying to set strategy looking in a rearview mirror. It's not going to work. Yeah,
absolutely. So the benchmark report, of course, also shared some valuable insights into how pension funds are investing in terms of their defensive investments and versus more aggressive investments and so forth. And what it did show is how different they are to a younger profile, which is a good thing, of course, when we think about I guess the time horizons for investment and so forth, and the types of investments that they pursue. Can I get you to maybe elaborate around what some of those findings were in this quarterly report?
Yeah, there was a number of areas where, again, and most of these things, as you say, they kind of fitted the pattern that we were kind of expecting, but in some cases, dramatically so. So limited recourse borrowing, for example, it's the sort of thing where you'd expect that it's somebody in accumulation looking to get some leverage to help build their balance, and that, if funds are taking advantage of those, you'd expect it to be those funds. Yeah. And it was dramatically so, with 7.8% of the holdings, if it was an accumulation fund, 7.8% of funds having some level of LRBA in them, whereas only 0.6 if they're in the pension phase. And keeping in mind, some of those pensions, we've said pension phase funds were where anyone was in pension, so you may have still had a member in there who was accumulation.
Composite of both.
Yeah, but dramatic difference in terms of that. Certainly, that leveraging and the use of LRBAs. But then even looking at other areas like property investment, where again, typically, there's been a lot of stories about SMSFs, driving property prices, which we've kind of addressed in the past. But the other thing again is that, property is obviously a long-term investment. It's not something that you want to get in and out of quickly. It's good to see again that it's the accumulation funds that tend to be, more focused on that, and particularly residential. So in the case of residential property, it's pension funds, it's only about 5% of them are investing in residential. So they've got a preference for commercial or rural property rather than that residential property. So, and it's nearly, a third of, about 14% of accumulation phase funds that are looking at that asset class.
And I think I was just going to say, so you raise a really couple of really important points there that regular data is now providing us, and I guess this is now important for the industry in terms of how we continue to dispel some of the myths. And I guess whilst the ATO's data has been really valuable in terms of the statistical overview, to be able to drill down at a far greater level gives not only class and its users, but the industry even more insight that enables us to start to dictate and advocate policy and the way in which the sector will continue to operate and hopefully thrive into the future. And I know class is one of the initial parties to the new SMSF Association think tank. So I'd be interested in your thoughts around why this data is so important now and is critical to breaking down the real story of what's happening inside SMSFs.
One of the reasons we started the benchmark report was we were concerned about the quality of the data, and there was lots of debate going on in the industry about what was happening with the SMSFs. And as you say, having that ATO data in aggregate is great for seeing, across the industry what's happening. But because it's based on annual return data, there's actually a lot of projection if you read the methodology and how they go about doing what they're doing. And particularly things like property, where they talk about the exposure that there is in property, it's based on potentially, quite, data that could be a year or two out of date. But then they're also then projecting that forward based on things like when they look at managed funds, they use benchmarks to assume the growth in the assets for those, and it assumes that you're investing in domestic shares and property. But that's an assumption because the ATO can't look through to see what types of managed funds you're holding. So we felt it was really important to be able to address things like, well, how much exposure are self-managed funds really getting to international, and what are they really doing around some of the other asset classes and things like LICs and ETFs, their use and the growth of that. Which is not immediately obvious from the ATO data. So we think that that's important that we get that information. We've worked with the association in the past where they've been trying to participate in policy discussions and so forth, and help to provide data for what they're doing. And yeah, the think tank being able to engage directly with the ATO around what we're doing and where the concerns are and what sorts of things the industry needs to be doing holistically, it's fantastic in terms of getting minds together and agreeing on what we feel needs to be addressed within the industry at that level.
That's good. So I guess in closing, if there's any, final comments that you'd like to make from the report, and most importantly, where people can access the SMSF Benchmark Report and find out more about CLASS.
I think there's a bit more detail in the report about the income and the fact that there's still a high level of domestic equities being held, and we put that down to that stereotype of the self-managed funds looking for that dividend yield and the franking credits that they need to then pay pensions out of. So, I think that's a clear sort of pattern that we are seeing there. But I think there is also some other good information in there in terms of the broader sort of asset classes, use of debt securities and other things that can be looked at in the report. And again, I would remind your listeners, if you have any questions, if there's things that you want to see us do with the data, then we're always keen to have suggestions about what sorts of things we should look at next and other areas of interest, because we want it to be topical. We want it to be kind of engaging and really drive some interest across the industry in terms of what's happening. In terms of where to get the report, you can go to class.com.au and there's a link there that'll take you straight through. If you go to the insights and ideas, and from there you can download not just this latest report, but all the earlier reports. So if you do want to look at the other areas that we were talking about, like the contribution splitting and commutations as a result of the super reform, you can see that in the older reports as well.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you once again, Kevin. I know you're a busy man, but you do openly make yourself available to these podcasts, so it is very much appreciated. So thank you to everyone for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me for next week's podcast. Thank you, Kevin. Very much appreciated once again.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Have a great day, everyone, and I look forward to you joining me in next week's podcast. Bye for now. Thanks for joining me today on the Smarter SMSF podcast. That was a smart move. If you'd like to find out more about today's topic, you can add a comment either at our website, smartersmsf.com, via our Facebook page, or using our Twitter handle @SmarterSMSF.